You're listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bob Keane. I'm the editor of the internationally recognized journal Fire Ecology. I'd like to welcome you today to a very special guest that we have and a very special topic, which I'm sure you will all enjoy. Today, we've got Abigail Croker talking about a paper called Changing Fire Regimes in East and Southern Africa's Savanna-Protected Areas, Opportunities and Challenges for Indigenous-Led Savanna Burning Emissions Abatement Schemes. Welcome, Abby. Could you introduce yourself?
Yes, hi. Thank you, Bob. Thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm Abigail Croker. I'm currently in my last year as a PhD student at Imperial College London, and I'm generally researching community-based fire management across Southern and Eastern African savanna-protected areas.
Which is an amazing, very flammable continent. Fire ecology in Africa is so cool. So could you give us a quick rundown about your paper? Tell us what it's all about.
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, first of all, we carried out a review of community-based fire management across Southern and Eastern savanna-protected areas, because it was starting to be kind of heralded as this great alternative bottom-up approach to mitigate large wildfires. But what we found is that there was a very, very limited literature on community-based fire management that was sort of guiding this narrative. So we carried out a review looking at different aspects of community-based governance, and we divided that into like 4 main categories. So community participation, participation in decision-making, and then also their initiative in project establishment and like long-term sponsorship. So we carried out this review to look at whether community-based fire management existed within savanna protected areas. We were exploring really what's called the wildfire paradox. So it's this pattern that we see emerging across sub-Saharan Africa, where there's large wildfires inside protected areas and almost next to nothing outside protected areas where people have been displaced to, and there's obviously a lot of settlement, population growth and livestock. And what we found actually in this literature on community-based fire management is that it didn't really exist, and proposals for its existence very much focus on savanna burning emissions abatement schemes, which were first established in Northern Australia. And we basically wanted to look at why these schemes are being, I guess, promoted in sub-Saharan Africa. There was 3 main assumptions that based this idea of transferring the Australian model to African savanna protected areas and it to be successful. So what we did is we actually applied a biogeographic framework to look at this. So we looked at the main assumptions. So first of all, the perceived similarities between nutrient-poor mesic savannas marked by distinct wet and dry seasons. Then the presence of extensive protected area networks, so each being over 1,000 kilometres squared. And then the third assumption was the accruement of similar fire management strategies practiced by indigenous landholders and pastoralists across the 2 regions. So we basically wanted to look at how effective these schemes can be in sub-Saharan Africa and how far they can be promoted, I guess, as a community-based fire management approach.
Very interesting. Wow, that's really amazing. So this is a fire ecology journal, I got to ask the fire ecology question. Is all of these burning abatement schemes, or most of them, really have political objectives? In the literature, how did you find where the ecology concerns balance the political concerns?
It's an interesting question, Bob, because there really is no balance. It's very political and very much less informed by ecology. By sort of applying this biogeographic framework, we divided the sort of climate biology and fire section from society, culture and fire. And then again, as well, from the topographic environment, which sort of looked at the fact that the savanna burning schemes in Northern Australia are carried out across indigenous lands versus in sub-Saharan Africa in protected areas, which are centrally governed by the government. So actually what we found is that these schemes are very much of national interest, because savanna burning is an activity that's permitted under the Kyoto Protocol as a national greenhouse gas emissions reduction activity. So it's very nationally focused. So it's a very strict accounting methodology that's set by the government because of the fact that these carbon credits can be traded in voluntary markets globally. But what we find in savanna protected areas is in Africa, is that these schemes very much, they're based around the fact that by transitioning the fire season to the early dry season, so by carrying out some prescribed burns or suppressing fire altogether, you're basically offsetting the emissions that would result from late dry season big wildfires. but the ecology between the savannas between Africa and Australia is exceptionally different. But essentially, these schemes, they're not compatible with savannas that are prone to woody thickening. And what we find in the African context is that savannas that are prone to woody thickening occur about where there's a mean annual precipitation around 600 to 700 millimeters. And these aren't compatible with savanna burning schemes. However, the schemes are actually being promoted in like Mayumbo woodlands, which do receive this much. And this is the reason why they're not compatible, is because sort of long-term climate dynamics and woody feedback. By shifting to the early dry season, it's been shown in Africa that there's been in certain areas a huge increase in methane emissions because of the moisture of the grass and the soil. So almost up to a 400% increase. And then also the issue is with these schemes ecologically is that we see across this region, there's actually more payment for ecosystem services schemes popping up that are including savanna burning. And under savanna burning activities, biosequestration is one of the methods to generate carbon credits. So these projects, such as like projects under REDD+ and the Clean Development Mechanism, can actually be misapplied in savanna habitats that then promote woody thickening. The ecologies are exceptionally different, and there's a lot of potential for misapplication without really factoring in the long-term biological and actually greenhouse gas emissions outcomes.
Yeah, that is extremely well said. People across the world have found out that if you don't pay attention to the ecology, you're going to have an adverse impact that you'll have to pay for years, as we in the United States know with our fire suppression program. You mentioned the Australian model. I spent a great deal of time in Northern Australia. Could you tell us a little about what that Australian model is, the savanna burning?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, the savanna burning schemes, they're a greenhouse gas emissions accounting activity under the Kyoto Protocol, and Australia was the first place to really like include this in its greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So basically, what it does is it aims to shift the fire seasonality to the early dry season to reduce fire frequency, extent, and intensity of the late dry season wildfires, and in turn, this reduces savanna fire greenhouse gas emissions because basically across Northern Australia, it's dominated by eucalyptus savannas, and 20% of these savannas burn annually in the late dry season, and this actually contributed to about 50% of the Northern Territory's annual greenhouse gas emissions, so a large amount. So they basically introduced these emissions abatement schemes, and there's two types. So first is just the emissions avoidance method, which is just you burn in the early dry season to offset late dry season. So by burning, you're reducing the fuel load. And then the second one came in later years, is the sequestration emissions avoidance method, which actually looks at accounting for above ground biomass and other biomass. So like dead wood, also actually soil carbon, etc. So it's based more on carbon sequestration in the long term. It can be applied with early dry season burning, but it's also applied with complete fire suppression. Yeah, and so they've been implemented across the Northern Territories, but I guess they're framed as indigenous-led because they're mainly across indigenous-owned land or reserves that are kind of where the indigenous people are in an agreement with the government. So actually, by carrying out these schemes and generating carbon credits, these landowners and pastoralists actually do benefit from these schemes. They are community, I guess, focused companies. They have to like come together and produce a company. However, there have been obviously criticisms about them there's a lot of elite capture. They don't actually represent all of the people, and how are the carbon benefits distributed.
Well, very, very interesting. So you did this wonderful literature survey and so on. What are the implications? How do you feel your study is going to be used in the future?
I think I would see it as it's potentially being used to shed some light onto those sort of developing savanna burning emissions abatement schemes or researching the area. I've spoken to some people working in South Africa who share very, very similar concerns. And actually, it was interesting at the Fire Ecology Congress last year. At the end of last year, I met some interesting people that are on the NGO side developing these schemes. And when I mentioned the ecological factors and how different they are and have they been considered, they answered with no. So it's just I guess it's shedding light on the differences between these two regions, and they really cannot be compared across any of the pyrogeographic kind of categories. So I guess it's just shedding light on that and hoping that those who are developing these schemes in the future really do take these into consideration. Otherwise, it could really result in, negligible greenhouse gas emissions outcomes, but also local livelihood vulnerabilities and massive biodiversity trade-offs. So I'm hoping that it's read by practitioners as well as researchers.
Thank you very much for this wonderful summary of your paper. I really appreciate it. Do you have any funding sources you'd like to acknowledge?
Yes, I would. The Grantham Institute have funded a lot of my research, and also the Leverhulme Centre for Wildfires, Environment and Society. They've also been exceptionally generous with funding a lot of my fieldwork in Sub-Saharan Africa, but also, the opportunity to attend the Fire Congress last year, which was a fabulous opportunity to meet everyone at the association.
Yes, I heard that many of my compatriots met you and found you a wonderful person. Really, again, love to thank you for coming on. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to read about this wonderful paper, it's available for free on the Fire Ecology website, delivered by Springer. Fire Ecology is wholly owned and overseen by the Associates of Fire Ecologists. So again, thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you at the next podcast. Thank you very much.